The sisters who served more than meat discovered that some hungers can never be satisfied with food alone. In the heart of rural America, where the setting sun painted golden streaks across weathered farmland, Eleanor and Clara Derby ran their late father's inn with the devotion of women who understood that feeding travelers was about more than filling empty bellies. It was about providing sanctuary in a harsh world. But on this particular autumn evening in 1847, as the last customer pushed back from their table with satisfied sighs, neither sister could have imagined that their carefully ordered world was about to shatter like fine china hitting stone floors. The inn that had been their refuge, their livelihood, and their father's legacy was hiding secrets darker than the shadows creeping across their kitchen walls. When Henry Lancaster stepped through their front door with his expensive coat and knowing smile, he brought with him more than just the chill of evening air. He carried letters sealed with old promises, debts written in invisible ink, and a past that Clara had buried so deep she'd convinced herself it never existed. Eleanor watched her sister's face drain of color as Henry spoke Clara's name, not as a stranger would, but with the familiarity of someone who had once whispered it in moments of passion. The sisters who had survived their father's death, financial ruin, and the endless demands of frontier hospitality were about to face their greatest test. Because Henry Lancaster hadn't come for their famous roast beef or warm bread, he had come to collect on a debt that would cost them everything they held dear. What secret had their father taken to his grave? Why did Clara tremble when Henry smiled? And when the truth finally emerged from the shadows of the past, would the bond between these sisters prove stronger than the forces determined to tear them apart? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The amber light of late afternoon filtered through the windows of the Derby Inn, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors, where Eleanor Derby moved with practiced efficiency. At 28, she possessed the sharp focus of a woman who had learned early that survival depended on attention to detail. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her calloused hands spoke of years spent scrubbing, cooking, and managing every aspect of their family business. "Clara, the Hendersons will be wanting their usual table by the window," Eleanor called to her sister, who stood at the large stone hearth, stirring a pot of beef stew that filled the room with rich, savory aromas. Clara Derby, 3 years older but somehow appearing more fragile, looked up from her work with eyes that held depths of unspoken sorrow. Where Eleanor was all sharp angles and determined efficiency, Clara moved through the world with a gentleness that drew people to her like moths to candlelight. Her auburn hair caught the firelight as she nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "I've set aside the good bread for them," Clara replied, her voice carrying the soft cadence that made even the roughest frontiermen remember their manners. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned last week that her James has been poorly." The inn buzzed with the comfortable chaos of evening service. Local workers from the timber mill occupied the long communal tables, their faces ruddy from outdoor labor and their voices raised in good-natured conversation. Travelers from the eastern settlements sat at smaller tables, studying their maps and discussing routes over plates of Clara's famous pot roast. Eleanor surveyed her domain with satisfaction tinged by constant worry. 2 years had passed since their father, Jacob Derby's sudden death from heart failure, leaving his daughters to inherit not only his beloved inn, but also the crushing responsibility of keeping it alive in an unforgiving economic climate. The inn represented more than mere business. It was the culmination of Jacob's American dream, built board by board with his own hands and dreams of prosperity for his family. "The Morrison party requested extra portions of your apple preserves," Eleanor mentioned, checking items off her mental list as she moved between tables, refilling coffee cups and collecting empty plates. "I told them it would cost extra." Clara smiled, the expression transforming her face and reminding Eleanor of happier times when their father's laughter had filled these same rooms. "You always were better with money than sentiment, Ellie. Someone has to be practical," Eleanor replied, though her tone held affection. She paused in her work, watching Clara ladle stew into bowls with the same careful attention she brought to everything she did. Despite their different temperaments, the sisters worked together with an efficiency born of necessity and deep mutual understanding. As the evening progressed, the inn gradually emptied until only the Henderson family remained, lingering over their coffee and the warmth of the common room. Eleanor was calculating the day's receipts when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the window. A lone rider emerged from the gathering dusk, his silhouette unfamiliar against the familiar landscape. Eleanor felt an instinctive wariness as she watched him dismount. Something about his bearing, the expensive cut of his traveling coat, the way he surveyed their humble establishment as if taking inventory. "We have a late arrival," Eleanor announced, but when she turned to inform Clara, she found her sister frozen at the hearth, her face pale as winter moonlight. The ladle trembled in Clara's hands, and the color seemed to drain from the room along with her composure. "Clara, what's wrong?" Eleanor's concern sharpened as she followed her sister's gaze to the window. "Do you know that man?" Before Clara could respond, heavy footsteps crossed the wooden porch, and the inn's front door opened with a creak that seemed unusually ominous in the sudden silence. The man who entered brought with him the scent of expensive tobacco and the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Henry Lancaster stood in the doorway like a figure from a half-remembered dream. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of distinguished handsomeness that came from good breeding and careful attention to appearance. His dark hair showed touches of silver at the temples, and his clothes spoke of prosperity achieved through means that ordinary people could only imagine. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education. His eyes swept the room, taking in the humble furnishings, the simple decoration, the honest wear that marked a working establishment. When his gaze found Clara, it lingered with an intensity that made Eleanor's protective instincts flare. "We're nearly closed for the evening," Eleanor said firmly, stepping between Henry and her sister. "But we can provide you with a meal and a room if you're traveling through." Henry's smile was perfectly polite, yet something about it unsettled Eleanor. "I'm not here as a customer, Miss Derby. I've come to speak with your sister about a matter of some importance." The way he said Clara's name, with a familiarity that implied intimate knowledge, sent a chill through Eleanor's blood. She glanced at Clara, who seemed to have turned to stone beside the hearth, her eyes wide with what looked like a mixture of fear and recognition. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe we've been introduced," Eleanor said, her voice taking on the steel that appeared whenever she sensed threats to her family or their livelihood. "And I don't recall Clara mentioning any business with strangers." "Henry Lancaster," he replied, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. "Though I'm hardly a stranger to your family, your father and I had extensive dealings over the years." Eleanor's mind raced through her memories of their father's business associates, but she couldn't recall Jacob ever mentioning anyone named Lancaster. Her father had been scrupulously honest about the inn's finances and his various business relationships, or so she had believed. "Clara," Henry continued, his attention returning to Eleanor's sister, despite Eleanor's obvious attempts to intercede. "I realize this may come as something of a shock, but there are matters we need to discuss. Matters your father left unresolved." Finally, Clara found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Henry, you shouldn't have come here." The admission hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Her sister not only knew this man, but was clearly disturbed by his presence, in ways that suggested their history went far beyond simple business acquaintance. "Perhaps we could speak privately," Henry suggested, his tone gentle but carrying an undertone of insistence. "There are things that need to be said, Clara, things that have waited far too long." Eleanor stepped forward, her jaw set with determination. "Anything you have to say to my sister can be said in front of me. We have no secrets between us." Henry's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I'm afraid that's not entirely accurate, Miss Eleanor. Your father was a good man, but he carried burdens that he chose not to share with his daughters. Burdens that now, unfortunately, fall to you." From his coat, Henry withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age and bearing their father's handwriting. Eleanor's breath caught as she recognized Jacob's careful script, though the formal legal language of the address was unlike anything she remembered her father writing. "What is that?" she demanded, though part of her already dreaded the answer. "A promissory note," Henry replied calmly. Your father borrowed a considerable sum of money from me several years ago to keep this inn operating during some particularly difficult times. The terms were quite specific, and the debt remains outstanding. Eleanor felt the world shift beneath her feet. Her father had never mentioned any such debt, never indicated that their financial struggles had driven him to seek private loans from mysterious benefactors. The inn's books, which she had studied obsessively since his death, showed no record of any dealings with Henry Lancaster. "That's impossible," she said, even as she reached for the envelope with trembling fingers. "Father kept meticulous records. He would have told us about any significant debts." "Your father was a proud man," Henry said softly, his gaze never leaving Clara's face. "Perhaps too proud to burden his daughters with the full extent of his struggles. But the debt exists, and the terms, well, the terms were quite unusual." Eleanor's hands shook as she unfolded the document, her eyes scanning the formal language and legal terminology that seemed to swim before her vision, but certain phrases stood out with horrible clarity. Sum of $2,000, personal guarantee, alternative forms of settlement. $2,000? Eleanor's voice cracked with disbelief. In 1847, such a sum represented more money than the inn typically earned in 3 years of operation. We don't have anywhere near that kind of money. We couldn't possibly." "I'm aware of your financial circumstances," Henry interrupted gently, "which is why your father and I agreed to alternative arrangements for settling the debt. Arrangements that I believe Clara remembers quite well." Clara's sob echoed through the suddenly silent room, a sound of such raw anguish that Eleanor felt her own heart breaking in response. Whatever history existed between her sister and this stranger, it clearly involved more than simple business transactions. "Get out," Eleanor said, her voice low and dangerous. "Get out of our inn and don't come back." Henry's expression remained unchanged, but he carefully folded the promissory note and returned it to his coat. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Miss Eleanor. The debt is legal and binding, and I've been more than patient in allowing it to remain unpaid, but my patience has limits." He moved toward the door, but paused on the threshold, looking back at Clara with an expression that might have been regret or calculation. "I'll be staying at the hotel in town for the next few days. When you're ready to discuss reasonable solutions to our mutual problem, you know where to find me." The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo through the inn like a gunshot. Eleanor and Clara stood frozen in the aftermath, the weight of revelation settling over them like a suffocating blanket. "Clara?" Eleanor said finally, her voice barely audible. "What aren't you telling me?" But Clara was already moving toward the stairs, her face streaked with tears and her hands pressed to her mouth as if trying to hold back words that threatened to spill out. "I can't, Ellie. Not tonight. Please, just let me be." Eleanor watched her sister disappear into the darkness of the upper floor, leaving her alone with questions that multiplied like shadows in the flickering candlelight. The inn that had always been her sanctuary suddenly felt like a trap, and the life she thought she understood had become as insubstantial as smoke. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the porch. Eleanor moved mechanically through her evening routine, banking the fire, checking the locks, extinguishing the lamps. But her mind kept returning to the terrible possibilities implied by Henry Lancaster's visit. $2,000, alternative arrangements, Clara's obvious recognition and fear. As she climbed the stairs to her own room, Eleanor realized that everything she'd believed about her family, her father, and her sister was about to be tested by truths that had been hidden in the darkness for far too long. The sisters, who served more than meat, were about to discover that some hungers could destroy everything they had worked to build. The morning sun cast pale light through Eleanor's bedroom window, but she had been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the previous evening's revelations. The sound of movement from the kitchen below indicated that Clara was already beginning preparations for the day, maintaining their routine despite the emotional earthquake that had shaken the foundation of their world. Eleanor dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, where she found Clara kneading bread with mechanical precision, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, but her movements steady and familiar. The normality of the domestic scene felt surreal, given the crisis looming over them. "We need to talk," Eleanor said without preamble. Clara's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their work. "I know. How long have you known Henry Lancaster?" The question hung in the air between them, and Eleanor watched as her sister's composure began to crack like ice under spring sun. Clara's shoulders sagged, and she leaned heavily against the wooden work table as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "We were engaged," Clara whispered, the words seeming to tear something inside her. "5 years ago, before Father became ill, before everything changed." Eleanor felt as though she had been struck. "Engaged? Clara, how could you never mention—" "Because it ended badly," Clara interrupted, finally meeting her sister's eyes. "Because Father forbade the match, and Henry left town in anger. Because I thought he was gone forever and that I could forget. What happened? Why did Father object?" Clara turned back to her bread, punching the dough with more force than necessary. "Father discovered that Henry wasn't the prosperous merchant he claimed to be. His wealth came from questionable sources. Investments in enterprises that Father considered morally objectionable." Eleanor's mind raced, trying to piece together the implications. But if Father distrusted him, why would he borrow money from him? "I don't know." Clara's voice cracked with frustration and pain. "Maybe desperation drove him to it. Maybe Henry offered terms that seemed reasonable at the time. Or maybe—" She trailed off, her expression growing troubled. "Maybe what? Maybe it was connected to me somehow. Maybe Henry used Father's knowledge of our past relationship to leverage the loan." The possibility chilled Eleanor to the bone. The idea that their father might have been manipulated through his daughter's romantic history added layers of violation to an already complex situation. "We need to see the full terms of this loan," Eleanor said, her practical nature asserting itself despite her emotional turmoil. "We need to understand exactly what Father agreed to." Clara nodded, wiping flour from her hands with a dish towel. "Henry mentioned alternative arrangements. I'm afraid to know what that means." "Whatever it means, we'll face it together," Eleanor said firmly, reaching out to squeeze her sister's hand. "We've survived worse than this." But even as she spoke the words, Eleanor wondered if that was true. They had survived their father's death and the financial struggles that followed, but those had been natural disasters, terrible but comprehensible. This felt different, more personal, and potentially more destructive. The inn's front door opened, admitting their helper Maria, whose weathered face immediately registered the tension in the kitchen. Maria had worked for the Derby family for nearly a decade, and her loyalty was absolute, but Eleanor hesitated to burden her with knowledge of their crisis. "Morning, girls," Maria said, hanging her shawl on a peg by the door. "You both look like you've been visited by ghosts." "Something like that," Eleanor replied carefully. Maria's sharp eyes moved between the sisters, reading the undercurrents of their distress with the skill of someone who had raised children of her own. "Whatever it is, it'll work itself out. Your father raised you to be strong." If only it were that simple, Eleanor thought. But Jacob Derby's strength might have led him to make decisions that now threatened to destroy everything he had built to protect. The day passed in a blur of routine activities that felt increasingly meaningless in the face of their looming crisis. Eleanor found herself studying every customer's face, wondering if Henry Lancaster might appear again with new demands or revelations. Clara moved through her duties like a woman in a trance, her usual warmth replaced by a brittle fragility that worried Eleanor deeply. That evening, after the last customer had departed and Maria had returned to her own cottage, Eleanor confronted the reality they could no longer avoid. "We have to go see him," she said as Clara cleaned the last of the dinner dishes. "We have to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Clara's hands stilled in the soapy water. "I was afraid you'd say that." "Are you afraid of him, Clara? Did he hurt you in some way?" The question had been plaguing Eleanor all day. The depth of Clara's distress suggested more than simple embarrassment about a broken engagement. There were shadows in her sister's eyes that spoke of deeper wounds. "Not physically," Clara said after a long pause, "but Henry has a way of making people feel as though they have no choices. When Father ended our engagement, Henry said things, made promises about what would happen if I ever changed my mind. I thought they were empty threats made in anger." "What kind of promises?" Clara turned to face her sister, and Eleanor saw fear flickering in her eyes like candle flames in a draft. "He said he would find a way to bind our families together permanently, that one way or another he would have what he considered rightfully his." The words sent ice through Eleanor's veins. The promissory note suddenly took on a more sinister aspect. Not just a business transaction, but a tool of manipulation, designed to force Clara into a position where she might have to reconsider Henry's suit. "We'll face him together," Eleanor repeated, though her voice carried less conviction than before. "Whatever he wants, whatever Father agreed to, we'll find a way to deal with it on our own terms." Clara nodded, but Eleanor could see the doubt in her expression. They both knew that people like Henry Lancaster rarely offered deals that could be easily refused. That night, Eleanor lay awake listening to the wind howl around the inn's walls and wondering what other secrets her father had taken to his grave. The inn that had always been her sanctuary now felt full of shadows and hidden dangers. Tomorrow they would confront Henry Lancaster and learn the full extent of the trap that might already be closing around them. Tonight, she could only hold on to the hope that the bond between the sisters would prove stronger than whatever forces sought to tear them apart. But as sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's dreams were haunted by the image of Clara's face when Henry Lancaster had spoken her name. The look of someone who had seen her future and feared what she had seen there. The morning air carried the bite of approaching winter as Eleanor and Clara walked the dusty road toward town, their steps synchronized despite the tension that stretched between them like a taut wire. The hotel where Henry Lancaster was staying rose before them like a monument to prosperity they had never known. 3 stories of painted wood and glass windows that caught the early sunlight and threw it back in brilliant fragments. Eleanor had dressed in her best dark wool dress, the one she wore to church and formal occasions, while Clara wore blue silk that brought out her eyes but also made her look pale and fragile. Neither sister spoke as they climbed the hotel's front steps, but Eleanor could feel Clara's anxiety radiating like heat from a forge. The hotel lobby impressed Eleanor despite her determination not to be influenced by displays of wealth. Rich carpets covered polished wooden floors, and oil paintings in gilded frames decorated walls that had probably never known the smoke and grease stains that marked the inn's honest walls. A clerk behind the front desk looked up from his ledger with the professional smile of someone paid to be pleasant to people who could afford the hotel's rates. "We're here to see Mr. Henry Lancaster," Eleanor announced, her voice carrying the authority she used to manage difficult customers. "Certainly, miss. May I tell Mr. Lancaster who's calling?" "The Mrs. Derby," Eleanor replied formally. "He's expecting us." The clerk nodded and disappeared up the main staircase, leaving the sisters to wait in the lobby's uncomfortable elegance. Eleanor noticed Clara's hands trembling and reached out to steady them with her own. "Remember," Eleanor whispered, "we're here to gather information, not to make any agreements. Whatever he proposes, we tell him we need time to consider." Clara nodded, but Eleanor could see the fear in her sister's eyes growing stronger with each passing moment. Whatever history existed between Clara and Henry Lancaster clearly involved more pain than Clara had yet revealed. Footsteps on the stairs announced the approach of 2 figures, the hotel clerk and Henry Lancaster himself. In the daylight, Henry appeared even more prosperous than he had the previous evening. His suit was perfectly tailored, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his bearing suggested a man accustomed to having his wishes treated as commands. "Miss Eleanor, Miss Clara," he greeted them with a smile that managed to be both charming and predatory. "How good of you to call. Perhaps we might speak more privately in my suite." Eleanor's instincts rebelled at the suggestion. "I think the lobby will serve our purposes adequately, Mr. Lancaster. We're not here for social calls." Henry's smile flickered but didn't disappear. Of course. Business first, as always with the Derby family. Your father was the same way. Direct to a fault. He gestured toward a seating area near the lobby's front windows, where high-backed chairs were arranged around a low table. Eleanor chose a position that allowed her to keep both the front door and the main staircase in sight, while Clara seemed to fold in on herself as she took the chair farthest from Henry. Now then, Henry began, settling into his chair with the ease of someone who had conducted many such negotiations. I trust you've had time to consider the situation I outlined yesterday evening. We've considered it, Eleanor replied carefully, but we need to understand the full terms of this alleged debt before we can discuss any resolution. Henry's eyebrows rose at the word alleged, but his tone remained pleasant. Certainly. Your father borrowed $2,000 from me in the spring of 1845. The loan was to cover immediate operating expenses for the inn, supplies, wages for temporary help during a difficult period, repairs to the building. Eleanor's memory stirred. The spring of 1845 had indeed been difficult. Unseasonably cold weather had damaged crops throughout the region, reducing the number of travelers and making it hard for local customers to afford regular meals at the inn. She remembered her father's worry, though he had assured his daughters that the situation was temporary. The terms of the loan, Henry continued, specified repayment within 2 years at 6% annual interest. However, your father was concerned about his ability to raise such a sum through normal business operations, so we agreed to an alternative form of security. Eleanor's stomach clenched. What kind of alternative security? Henry's gaze shifted to Clara, who seemed to shrink further into her chair. Your father offered a personal guarantee that if the monetary debt could not be repaid, it would be settled through a marriage contract between his elder daughter and myself. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She heard Clara's sharp intake of breath and saw her sister's face go white as parchment. The true nature of Henry's trap was now revealed. Not just a financial obligation, but a binding agreement that would trade Clara's freedom for the family's solvency. That's barbaric, Eleanor said, her voice shaking with outrage. You're talking about buying my sister like a piece of property. I'm talking about honoring a legal contract, Henry replied calmly. Your father was desperate, Miss Eleanor. The inn was weeks away from foreclosure, and no legitimate bank would extend him credit. I offered him a solution that allowed him to save his business and provide security for his family's future. By selling Clara, by arranging a marriage that would have been beneficial to all parties involved. Clara and I were already engaged at the time. Your father's intervention ended what would have been a happy union. This arrangement simply provided an opportunity to correct that unfortunate situation. Eleanor turned to look at Clara, who sat frozen with tears streaming down her face. The trap was more complete than Eleanor had imagined. Not only did Henry hold their financial future hostage, but he had managed to make Clara the instrument of her own bondage. The debt came due last month, Henry continued. I've been patient in allowing the monetary payment option to lapse, but my patience has limits. Clara can marry me willingly, or I can pursue legal remedies that will result in the inn being sold to satisfy the debt. Either way, I will have what I was promised. There has to be another way, Eleanor said desperately. We could arrange a payment schedule, work out some kind of compromise. $2,000 plus accumulated interest, Henry interrupted. Can you raise that sum, Miss Eleanor? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Eleanor knew their financial situation to the penny. They could barely keep up with current expenses, let alone pay off a massive debt. The inn's entire value, if sold, might approach $2,000, but that would leave them homeless and destitute. I need time to think, Clara said suddenly, her voice barely audible. I need time to consider my options. Henry leaned forward, his expression softening into what might have been genuine concern. Of course, my dear, this is a momentous decision, and I wouldn't want you to feel rushed. But please remember that delay only increases the financial burden on your family. Every day we wait is another day of accumulated interest. Eleanor wanted to grab her sister and flee the hotel to escape the suffocating web of manipulation that Henry had woven around them, but she forced herself to remain calm, to think like the practical businesswoman her father had trained her to be. "How long do we have?" she asked. "A week," Henry replied. "I have business affairs that require my attention in other towns, but I'll return next Monday," for Clara's answer. "I trust that will provide adequate time for consideration." Eleanor nodded curtly and rose from her chair, helping Clara to her feet. Her sister seemed to have aged years in the span of their conversation, and Eleanor felt her own strength being tested by the weight of responsibility that had suddenly descended upon them. "Humming week," Eleanor confirmed, "and will expect to see the original promissory note and any other relevant documents." "Naturally," Henry agreed, standing as well. "I've always believed in conducting business with complete transparency." The irony of the statement would have been laughable if the situation weren't so dire. Eleanor guided Clara toward the hotel's front door, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of wealth and manipulation. But Henry's voice stopped them before they reached the exit. "Clara," he called softly, "I want you to know that I bear no ill will toward your family. Your father was a good man who found himself in an impossible situation. I'm simply trying to honor the agreement we made." Clara turned back, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And if I refuse? If I choose to let the inn be sold rather than marry you?" Henry's expression grew regretful, but his voice remained firm. "Then you and your sister will face the world with nothing but the clothes on your backs. I take no pleasure in that prospect, but business is business, and contracts must be honored." Eleanor felt Clara sag against her, and she tightened her grip on her sister's arm. Without another word, she guided Clara out of the hotel and into the harsh light of morning. They walked home in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the impossible choice that now faced them. The inn came into view like a refuge, but Eleanor now understood that it might also be their prison. A place they could only keep by sacrificing Clara's freedom to a man who had already proven his willingness to manipulate and coerce. That evening, as they went through the motions of serving dinner to their customers, Eleanor found herself studying each familiar face and wondering if these people would be the same if they knew about the crisis threatening the Derby family. Would the Hendersons still smile and joke about the weather if they knew Clara might be forced into marriage to save the family business? After the last customer departed, Eleanor and Clara sat by the fireplace, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between them like smoke. "There has to be another way," Eleanor said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched for hours. Clara looked up from her needlework, her face drawn with exhaustion and grief. "What way, Ellie? We don't have $2,000. We don't have any assets worth that much, except the inn itself. We could sell it voluntarily," Eleanor suggested, though the words tasted like ashes in her mouth. "At least then we'd have some control over the terms, maybe negotiate better prices." "And then what?" Clara interrupted. "Where would we go? What would we do? This inn is all we know, Ellie. It's our home, our livelihood, our connection to Father. If we lose it, we lose everything that matters." Eleanor stared into the fire, watching the flames dance among the logs her father had chopped the autumn before his death. Every board in the inn's walls, every stone in its foundation, represented years of Jacob Derby's dreams and determination. The thought of losing it to Henry Lancaster's manipulation was almost unbearable. "What was he really like?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Henry, I mean, when you were engaged." Clara's hands stilled on her needlework, and for a moment Eleanor thought her sister wouldn't answer, but then Clara began to speak, her voice distant and measured. "He was charming, attentive. He made me feel like the most important person in the world. He had traveled to cities I'd only read about, and he told stories that made our little world seem small and provincial. But there were moments when I caught glimpses of something else underneath the charm, a coldness when things didn't go his way, a calculation in how he dealt with people who couldn't benefit him. Father saw it before I did. Eleanor absorbed this information, adding it to her growing understanding of Henry Lancaster's character. A man who combined charm with manipulation, who could wait years to spring a trap that would give him exactly what he wanted. "Won't give up," Clara continued. "Whatever we decide, Henry isn't the kind of man who accepts defeat gracefully. If I refuse to marry him, he'll find other ways to make our lives difficult. Then we'll face those difficulties together," Eleanor said firmly. "I won't let him buy you, Clara. Not for the inn, not for anything." But even as she spoke the words, Eleanor wondered if she would have the strength to maintain that resolve when Monday arrived and Henry Lancaster returned for his answer. The weight of responsibility for her sister's future, for their family's legacy, for the home that had sheltered them through every crisis, might prove too much for even her determined spirit to bear. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and reminding Eleanor that winter was coming. A season that would test their resolve and their resources in ways they might not be prepared to handle. The sisters who served more than meat were about to learn that some prices were too high to pay, and some hungers could consume everything they held dear. The following days passed in a haze of desperate planning and mounting anxiety. Eleanor threw herself into researching their options with the determination of a woman who refused to accept defeat, while Clara withdrew into herself, moving through her daily routines like a sleepwalker. Eleanor had ridden to the county seat to consult with a lawyer about the legality of Henry's promissory note, only to return with devastating news. The contract was perfectly legal and binding. Jacob Derby's signature was genuine, the terms were clearly stated, and the alternative settlement clause had been properly witnessed and notarized. $1,000 plus accumulated interest comes to $2,300, Eleanor told Clara as they sat in their kitchen after another sleepless night. "Even if we sold everything, the inn, the land, all our possessions, we might raise $1,800 at best." Clara continued kneading bread, her movements mechanical and precise. "And that assumes we could find a buyer willing to pay fair value quickly. The lawyer said Henry could force a sheriff's sale if we default on the debt. Property sold that way typically brings much less than market value. So we lose everything regardless," Clara said quietly. "Unless I marry him." The words hung in the air like a curse. Eleanor wanted to deny them, to find some flaw in the trap that had been set for them. But her practical nature forced her to acknowledge the reality of their situation. "There might be one other option," Eleanor said carefully. "I've been thinking about Uncle Thomas in California." Clara looked up sharply. Their father's brother had left for the goldfields years earlier and had reportedly done well for himself, but they hadn't heard from him in over 2 years and had no way of knowing if he was even still alive. "Even if we could contact him, even if he were willing to help, there's no way to get a message to California and receive a response before Monday," Clara pointed out. Eleanor nodded reluctantly. She had already considered and discarded dozens of potential solutions, each proving impossible given their time constraints and limited resources. That evening brought an unexpected visitor. Maria appeared at their door carrying a covered basket and wearing an expression of grim determination. "I've been hearing talk in town," she announced without preamble, setting her basket on the kitchen table, "about some fancy gentleman asking questions about your family, about your father's business dealings." Eleanor and Clara exchanged glances. They had been careful not to discuss their crisis with anyone, but in a small town, secrets had a way of spreading like ripples on a pond. "What kind of questions?" Eleanor asked. "About debts, about your financial situation, about whether you girls might be looking to sell the inn." Maria's weathered hands worked nervously at her apron strings. "I brought what I could spare." She lifted the cloth covering her basket, revealing a collection of coins and crumpled bills that probably represented Maria's entire life savings. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes at the gesture. "Maria, we can't accept this," she protested. "It's not nearly enough to solve our problem, and we won't have you impoverishing yourself." "This inn has been my home too for 10 years, Maria interrupted firmly. "Your father gave me work when no one else would hire a widow with no family. I won't stand by and watch his legacy be destroyed by some smooth-talking stranger. Eleanor picked up the money, counting it quickly, perhaps $50 in total, a significant sum for someone in Maria's position, but barely a fraction of what they owed Henry Lancaster. Besides, Maria continued, I'm not the only one who's willing to help. The Hendersons are talking about organizing the whole community. People remember your father's kindness, and they know what this inn means to the town. The idea of their neighbors sacrificing their own limited resources to help solve the Derby family's crisis both touched Eleanor's heart and filled her with shame. These were hard-working people who struggled to provide for their own families. Asking them to bear the burden of Jacob Derby's secret debts seemed unconscionable. We appreciate the offer, Eleanor said carefully, but this is our family's problem to solve. Maria's eyes flashed with the fire that had made her such an effective manager of unruly customers and kitchen crises. Your family's problems became this community's problems the day your father opened his doors to anyone who needed a meal and a warm place to sleep. This inn has been a refuge for everyone in these parts, and we won't see it destroyed without a fight. That night, Clara found Eleanor sitting at their father's old desk, surrounded by ledgers and legal documents, a lamp burning low beside stacks of papers covered with calculations and crossed-out figures. Still looking for miracle solutions? Clara asked gently, settling into the chair beside her sister. Still looking for alternatives to letting Henry Lancaster buy you like a prize heifer? Eleanor replied grimly. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on their father's photograph hanging on the wall above the desk. What if marriage to Henry wouldn't be as terrible as we're imagining? Eleanor's head snapped up, alarmed by the resignation in her sister's voice. Clara, don't even think about. He's not a monster, Ellie. He never hurt me when we were engaged. He was attentive, generous, perfectly proper in his behavior. Maybe I could learn to be content with him. Content? Eleanor's voice rose with indignation. You're talking about spending the rest of your life with a man who manipulated our father's desperation to trap you into marriage, a man who's willing to destroy our family to get what he wants. And the alternative is losing everything father built, becoming destitute, wandering the world with no home and no means of support, Claire countered. At least as Henry's wife, I would be secure, comfortable, and you would be welcome in his household. He's made that clear. The thought of living on Henry Lancaster's charity, of watching her sister trapped in a loveless marriage while pretending gratitude for the privilege, made Eleanor feel physically ill. There has to be another way, she insisted. We just haven't found it yet. But time was running out, and both sisters knew it. Monday was only 3 days away, and despite Eleanor's desperate research and calculations, no miracle solution had appeared. On Saturday evening, as they served what might be their last meal in the inn if Clara refused Henry's proposal, Eleanor found herself memorizing every detail of the familiar routine. The way Clara moved between the stove and the serving area with unconscious grace, the comfortable murmur of conversation from their regular customers, the warm glow of lamplight on wooden walls that had witnessed decades of ordinary human moments. If they lost the inn, they would lose more than their home and livelihood. They would lose their connection to their father's dreams, their place in the community that had shaped their lives, their identity as the Derby sisters who served more than meat to anyone who needed sustenance and shelter. As the last customer departed and they began the familiar ritual of cleaning up for the night, Eleanor made a silent promise to her father's memory and her sister's future. Whatever happened on Monday, she would not allow Henry Lancaster to destroy everything they held dear without a fight. But as she banked the fire and extinguished the lamps, Eleanor wondered if determination alone would be enough to overcome the trap that had been so carefully constructed around them. The sisters who had survived their father's death and years of financial struggle were about to face their greatest test. Monday morning dawned gray and cold, with frost covering the windows of the inn like intricate lacework. Eleanor had been awake since before sunrise, pacing the kitchen floor and rehearsing arguments she knew would prove futile against Henry Lancaster's legal advantages. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, staring out at the frost-covered yard where their father used to chop wood. "We'll be here soon," Clara said quietly, her voice holding a strange calm that alarmed Eleanor more than tears or hysteria would have. "You don't have to do this," Eleanor said for what felt like the 100th time in 3 days. "We'll find another way. We'll start over somewhere else if we have to." Clara looked up at her sister with eyes that seemed older than her 31 years. "With what resources, Ellie? We have no family connections outside this town, no marketable skills beyond running an inn, no money to travel or establish ourselves elsewhere. Henry knows this. He's counted on our desperation from the beginning." The sound of hoofbeats on the road outside interrupted their conversation. Eleanor moved to the window and saw Henry Lancaster approaching on a fine bay horse, his posture straight and confident despite the early hour. He dismounted and tied his horse to the post beside the inn's front door, then stood for a moment looking up at the building, as if already calculating improvements he might make as its owner. Eleanor opened the door before Henry could knock, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of entering their home as a welcome guest. "Mr. Lancaster." "Good morning, Miss Eleanor, Miss Clara." Henry's smile was perfectly pleasant, but Eleanor caught the glitter of anticipation in his eyes. "I trust you've had adequate time to consider our arrangement." "We've considered it," Eleanor replied curtly. "Perhaps we might discuss the matter outside. It's a private family matter." Henry nodded graciously and gestured toward the inn's front porch, where 3 wooden chairs provided a clear view of the road and the surrounding countryside. The setting felt grimly appropriate for what might be their final conversation as free agents of their own destiny. Clara joined them, her face pale but composed. She had dressed carefully in her best green wool dress, and Eleanor realized with a pang that her sister wanted to face this moment with dignity, regardless of the outcome. "I assume you've reached a decision," Henry said, settling into his chair with the ease of someone who had no doubt about the conclusion of their negotiations. Eleanor looked at Clara, hoping for some sign that her sister had found the strength to refuse Henry's demands, but Clara's expression remained carefully neutral. "Before we discuss my answer," Clara said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "I want to understand exactly what you're proposing. If I agree to marry you, what assurance do I have that you'll honor your part of the bargain?" Henry leaned forward slightly, his attention focusing entirely on Clara. "The promissory note will be marked as satisfied in full upon our marriage. The inn will remain in your family's ownership, with Eleanor free to continue operating it as she sees fit. You will, of course, be welcome to assist in its management if you choose, though, as my wife, you'll have no financial need to work. And if I refuse, then I will pursue the legal remedies available to me as your father's creditor. The inn will be sold to satisfy the debt, and any remaining funds will be returned to your family after expenses and legal fees are deducted." Eleanor felt her heart clench at the clinical way Henry described the destruction of their lives. To him, their family's legacy was simply a business transaction to be resolved efficiently. Clara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the frosted fields that stretched toward the horizon. Eleanor held her breath, praying for some miracle that would give her sister the strength to choose freedom over security. "I need one more day," Clara said finally. Henry's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Miss Clara, we agreed that today would bring your final answer. My business affairs require—" "A more day," Clara repeated, her voice taking on a steel Eleanor had rarely heard from her gentle sister. "You've waited 5 years for this moment, Mr. Lancaster. Surely you can wait 24 more hours." Eleanor saw something flicker across Henry's features, irritation perhaps, or calculation, but after a moment he nodded gracefully. "Of course, my dear. I can appreciate the magnitude of the decision you're facing, but I'm afraid I cannot extend the deadline beyond tomorrow. Wednesday morning, I must have your final answer." After Henry departed, Eleanor and Clara returned to the kitchen, where the normal routine of preparing for the day's customers provided a welcome distraction from the emotional weight of their situation. But Eleanor noticed that Clara moved through her tasks with a different quality of attention, as if she were memorizing every detail of their shared work. "What are you planning?" Eleanor asked when they finally had a moment of privacy. Clara smiled, and for the first time in days the expression seemed genuine. I'm planning to save our family's legacy and my own soul in the bargain. Before Eleanor could ask for clarification, the inn's first customers of the day arrived, and Clara threw herself into serving them with a warmth and attentiveness that seemed to glow from within. Eleanor watched her sister with growing puzzlement and concern, unable to understand what had changed in Clara's demeanor. That evening, after their last customer had departed, Clara asked Eleanor to sit with her by the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and Eleanor was reminded of countless evenings they had spent in this same spot with their father, discussing the day's events and planning for the future. I want to tell you about a letter I received today, Clara began, reaching into her apron pocket. It came with the afternoon mail. Eleanor's breath caught as Clara produced an envelope bearing the distinctive handwriting she recognized as belonging to their Uncle Thomas. The letter was postmarked from Sacramento, California, and dated just 2 weeks earlier. He's alive, Eleanor whispered. Uncle Thomas is alive. Clara nodded, unfolding the letter with careful hands. More than alive. He's prospered beyond our wildest dreams, Ellie. The gold rush made him wealthy, and he's invested his earnings in land and businesses throughout California. He writes that he's been trying to contact us for months, but his letters were misdirected. Eleanor felt hope flare in her chest like a newly kindled fire. Does he know about our situation? Can he help us? He knows Father is dead, Clara replied. He received word through mutual acquaintances several months ago, and yes, he can help us. He's offered to send enough money to clear any debts and establish us in comfortable circumstances. Eleanor stared at her sister in amazement. Then why didn't you tell Henry this morning? Why agree to another day? Clara's smile took on a mysterious quality that reminded Eleanor of their father when he was planning a particularly satisfying surprise. Because I wanted one more night to consider all of our options carefully. And because I wanted Henry Lancaster to spend one more night believing he had won. The next morning brought another frost, but Eleanor felt warmth spreading through her chest as she and Clara prepared for what they both knew would be their final confrontation with Henry Lancaster. Clara had dressed in her finest blue dress, the one that brought out her eyes and reminded Eleanor of happier times when their biggest concerns had been whether they had enough flour for the week's baking. Henry arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, his punctuality suggesting an eagerness to conclude their business that he was trying to conceal behind his usual polished courtesy. "Good morning, ladies," he said, removing his hat with a flourish. "I trust the extra day has provided the clarity you needed, Miss Clara?" Clara rose from her chair with a grace that seemed to illuminate the entire room. "Indeed it has, Mr. Lancaster. I have reached my decision." Eleanor held her breath, though Clara had assured her the previous evening that everything would work out according to plan. "I will not marry you," Clara announced, her voice carrying across the inn's common room with the clarity of church bells on Sunday morning. "Not today, not ever, not under any circumstances you might contrive." Henry's smile froze on his face, and Eleanor saw the mask of courtesy slip to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. "I see. Then I'm afraid I must pursue legal remedies to collect the debt your father owed me. The inn will be sold, and you and your sister will be left with nothing." Clara reached into her reticule and withdrew Uncle Thomas's letter, along with a bank draft that made Eleanor's eyes widen with amazement. "Actually, Mr. Lancaster, I believe you'll find that the debt has been satisfied in full." Eleanor watched Henry's face transform as he examined the bank draft, seeing his carefully constructed trap dissolving before his eyes. The amount was more than sufficient to cover the original loan plus accumulated interest, with enough remaining to ensure the inn's continued operation. "Where did you get this money?" Henry demanded, his polished facade cracking to reveal the manipulative schemer underneath. "From family," Clara replied simply. "You see, Mr. Lancaster, you made one crucial error in your calculations. You assumed we were alone in the world with no resources beyond what you could observe in our humble establishment. But family bonds extend far beyond the walls of this inn, and love finds ways to overcome even the most carefully constructed obstacles. his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "This is highly irregular. The terms of the loan specifically provided for alternative settlement arrangements." "The terms provided for alternative arrangements in the event that monetary payment could not be made," Eleanor interrupted, finding her voice at last. "Since monetary payment can and will be made, those alternative arrangements are no longer relevant." Clara handed Henry the bank draft with a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. "Consider your debt satisfied, Mr. Lancaster, and consider yourself no longer welcome in our establishment." Eleanor watched with satisfaction as Henry Lancaster stalked out of their inn, his carefully laid plans crumbling around him like autumn leaves in a strong wind. The door slammed behind him with a finality that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. "Is it really over?" Eleanor asked, hardly daring to believe that their nightmare had ended so suddenly and completely. Clara embraced her sister, and Eleanor felt years of tension and worry melting away like spring snow. "It's really over, Ellie. Uncle Thomas's letter included an invitation for both of us to join him in California if we choose, or he's happy to provide the resources we need to continue operating the inn here." Eleanor looked around the familiar common room, seeing it with new eyes. The inn that had been their prison had become their sanctuary once again, but now it represented choice rather than obligation, freedom rather than desperate survival. "What do you want to do?" Eleanor asked. "Stay here or seek our fortunes in California?" Clara moved to the window, looking out at the frost-covered yard where their father had chopped wood and dreamed of prosperity for his daughters. "I think Father would want us to choose based on what makes us happy, not what feels safest or most practical." Eleanor joined her sister at the window, watching the sun break through the morning clouds and begin melting the frost from the grass. "Then I choose to stay here, at least for now. This inn is our home, and this community is our family. But knowing we have the option to leave makes staying feel like a choice instead of a trap." Clara nodded, her expression peaceful for the first time in weeks. "I agree. Though I think we should plan a visit to Uncle Thomas soon. I'd like to thank him in person for giving us back our freedom." That evening, as they served dinner to customers who had no idea how close they had come to losing their favorite inn, Eleanor marveled at the transformation that had occurred in just 24 hours. The familiar routines that had felt like desperate necessities the night before now felt like chosen pleasures. Maria, who had somehow learned about their change in circumstances through the mysterious communication networks that existed in small towns, appeared in the kitchen with tears of joy in her eyes and a celebratory cake she had baked for the occasion. "I told you this community wouldn't let the inn be destroyed," she said proudly, setting the cake on the counter where its frosting spelled out, "Derby Inn Forever" in careful script letters. As Eleanor and Clara served cake to their customers and accepted congratulations from neighbors who had heard the news, Eleanor realized that they had gained something more valuable than financial security. They had learned that they were not alone in the world, that family and community created bonds stronger than legal contracts or financial manipulation. The sisters who served more than meat had discovered that love and loyalty could overcome even the most carefully constructed obstacles, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from fighting battles alone, but from accepting the help that was offered by hearts that truly cared. Later that night, as Eleanor and Clara cleaned up from their impromptu celebration, Clara paused in her work to look around the inn's common room with satisfaction. "Do you know what I realized today?" she asked her sister. "What's that?" "We really do serve more than meat in this inn. We serve hope to people who need it, comfort to those who are far from home, and connection to anyone who might be feeling lost or alone." Eleanor smiled, understanding exactly what her sister meant. Their father had built more than a business when he created the Derby Inn. He had created a place where people could find exactly what they needed, whether that was a hot meal, a warm bed, or simply the knowledge that someone cared about their well-being. And now we get to continue serving all of those things for as long as we choose, Eleanor added, not because we're trapped by circumstances, but because it's what we love to do. As they extinguished the lamps and banked the fire for the night, both sisters felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing they had faced their greatest challenge and emerged stronger than before. The inn settled around them with the comfortable creaks and sighs of a building that had sheltered generations of travelers and would continue to do so for generations to come. The sisters, who served more than meat, had learned that some hungers could only be satisfied by love, family, and the knowledge that they had the strength to overcome any obstacle when they faced it together. The sisters who served more than meat stands as a testament to the enduring power of family bonds, community support, and the courage to face seemingly impossible challenges with grace and determination. Set against the backdrop of 1800s America, this story weaves together themes of love, sacrifice, redemption, and the discovery that true strength comes not from facing hardships alone, but from accepting the help that love makes available. Through Eleanor and Clara's journey from desperation to triumph, readers witness the transformation of obstacles into opportunities, of threats into catalysts for growth, and of potential tragedy into lasting victory. The Derby Inn serves not only as the setting for their struggles, but as a symbol of how places become sanctuaries when they are built on foundations of service, compassion, and genuine care for others' well-being. In the end, the sisters learn that they truly do serve more than meat. They serve hope, healing, and the irreplaceable comfort that comes from knowing someone cares enough to offer shelter from life's storms.